years. They had all of his relatives who were standing in for him. They were the regents. Well, the Islamic Republic of Iran's constitution calls the supreme leader the regent of the 12th Imam. So Ahmadinejad said, well, wait a second, we don't need a regent. I'm talking to him directly. And that has gotten him into quite a bit of political trouble at home. And now they're talking, Khamenei is talking about getting rid of Ahmadinejad, getting rid of the post of the presidency. I think these are very dangerous times. Ahmadinejad has a great deal of support within the Revolutionary Guards, although there's some who do not support him. And they are the ones with the nuclear capabilities. So I would just add one more thing, and then I'm going to tell you about my foundation, and then I'd like to open this up for questions. Where is Rabbi Houseman? He just, oh, there you go, okay. I hate to contradict my host on one thing, but I've got to contradict you on one thing. It's even worse than you mentioned in your opening remarks. Okay. It's worse than you mentioned. The missile that the Israelis tested yesterday was not one of the missile defense systems, arrow system, which they've tested many, many times quite successfully and have deployed. It was a Jericho 3. And the Jericho 3 is a ICBM nuclear-capable missile. Now, I was at a forum in Washington Monday, I think it was, talking about EMP and talking about Iranian EMP with a number of different people, including a former CIA officer named Chet Nagel, who writes novels about this sort of thing. He says, you know, if I were the Israelis, I wouldn't hit their nuclear plants. I mean, why do that? First of all, you won't get them all. This is what I believe, too. And second of all, you know, there's a better way. I said, gee, really? What is it? He said, well, you know, why don't the Israelis launch a nuclear EMP over Iran? That way you've got no charred balls in the ground. And all of the plants, wherever they are, stop working because there's no more power. Now, I don't know that that's what the Israeli government is thinking of. I can't stand here and tell you that for a fact. What I can tell you as a fact, because I know people who are in the security cabinet, well, for many, many years, is that there is no desire to launch military strikes against Iran. Why should Israel have to do this? Why should this be Israel's responsibility? They didn't create the Iranian nuclear weapons threat. They didn't transfer technology to Iran to help them to build centrifuges. They didn't provide them the designs that Pakistan did and that China did. They didn't help build their missiles like the Russians did. They didn't supply the dual-use technology like the Germans did. They're just on the receiving end of it because they happen to be Jews. But you know, Israel will do what Israel has to do. I believe that there is a better way. I believe that there is a better way. I'm not sure that we still have time for this, but I believe there's a better way, and it's to help the people of Iran get rid of the regime. You know, I spent 18 years in France, and I joke about France a lot. I wrote a book called The French Betrayal of America, mainly about Jacques Chirac and Chirac's betrayal of France as well as America. But we don't worry about French nuclear weapons. We don't see them aimed at us. France is a democracy. We don't worry about British nuclear weapons. We don't see them as a threat. We don't see a threat from Israeli nuclear weapons. We see a threat from the regime in Tehran. The threat is the regime, even more than the weapons, even more than the weapons. If there were a completely different regime in Iran, a democratic regime in Iran, and they had nuclear weapons, I wouldn't be happy, but I wouldn't be losing sleep at night the way I do today, thinking about Iran launching an EMP against us. So I think there's a better way, and I think that way is to help the people of Iran to get rid of the regime. There's widespread popular discontent in Iran. When you see what this regime does to its own people, it's clear that they won't hesitate to murder their neighbors. This regime sanctions the sale of 12-year-old girls into slavery. So why wouldn't they take the women of their neighbors as slaves? This regime has murdered 100,000 of its own people as political dissidents. Why would they hesitate to murder people who are not even Iranian, who don't even have that in common with them? So I think the better way is to help the people of Iran, who know this regime much better than we can ever know it. They know its strengths, they know its weaknesses, they know the names of the people in charge, they know their cousins and their nephews, they know where they live, they know their telephone numbers. I think we should be helping the people of Iran to get rid of the regime. That's what my foundation, the FDI, the Foundation for Democracy in Iran, tries to do. Very difficult task. We get no help from the US government. We get very little help from others, but we all do this on a volunteer basis, and I travel a lot into the region. I was in northern Iraq earlier this year, visiting the bases of rebel Kurds, Iranian Kurds in northern Iraq. We all this summer have waged a pretty effective war against the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards Corps. We should be helping people like that. And we're not. We're doing nothing. So have a look at our website. It's Iran.org. My personal website that Rabbi Hausman told you about is KenTimmerman.com. That's my name, KenTimmerman.com. I do have a book outside. We have some copies of it. It's about the origins of Islam, but it's a fiction. It's a fiction told from the point of view of an Iraqi Christian interpreter working for U.S. Special Forces in Iraq. So it's a war story. It's about the war in Iraq, but he discovers a secret book, Secrets of the Beginnings of Islam. I won't tell you any more than that. It's the jihadis are after him because he's discovered the secrets. Now there's a lot of authentic research in the book from Muslim texts, Hadith in particular. So it's not entirely made up. I put into fictional books what I can't write as nonfiction without getting sued. So I have some of those outside as well. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Sir, I just have two simple questions. I'm going from memory, but is it true that if you have silicon circuitry and you wrap it in enough protective lead shielding, that after the CMP pulse blast occurred, you could unwrap it and it would still work?
Yes. The question is, can you protect your computers or your cell phones and stuff like that in an EMP bag or lead shielding and stuff like that? Absolutely. They call it a Faraday cage. And again, we used to do this during the Cold War.
Yeah.
Did anybody work at the Pentagon in the Cold War or the military? I mean, you had these ridiculous cages that you put around your computers. Ridiculous. They weren't ridiculous at all. They seemed ridiculous. The problem is, it'd work, but there wouldn't be anything to connect it to.
Yeah.
Your other question?
My other question, I seem to remember from the 79 takeover of Tehran, the Ayatollah, was it said that the USA was the great Satan and Israel was the little Satan?
Yes, yes.
We can't hear his question.
Okay. His question was,
Sorry.
is it true that in 1979, when the Islamic Revolution took over, that Khomeini called the United States the great Satan and Israel the little Satan? And yes, it was true. And they continue to use those terms today. And that should tell us something. It should tell us something. Israel is the little Satan. They are not the big Satan. They are not the biggest target. Israel is absolutely a target of the Islamic Republic of Iran. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. But never forget that we are the great Satan. And if they can get us, that's what they really want.
Thank you.
Yes?
Yeah. To your point about the better way, getting to the better way.
Oh, we have a mic. No, here we go.
We're going to see if it works.
Check 1, 2.
Yeah.
It works.
Right into it.
Speak into it.
I'll make it a little louder.
Okay. Say when. I hate to repeat myself.
Wait, just speak loud.
He's going back. Fine.
Hello?
Just talk directly
Just
into
go ahead.
it.
Just talk directly into it.
There you
Can you hear
go.
it? Okay, that works. To your point about the better way, Obviously, Iran has been a major backer of the Assad regime in Syria, and they're under a great deal of pressure right now. The Syrians are Alawite, they're not Sunni, they've been killing off lots of Sunnis. As a result, my understanding is that their stock and trade is going down with the rest of the Arab world, who is primarily Sunni. So I'd like you to address sort of that and what we can do to sort of hasten the demise of the Assad regime, which might have some impact on Iran too, and hasten your better way scenario.
I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it. Beware what you wish for. Beware what you wish for. Look at what happened in Libya, where we had a dictator, Gaddafi, but a dictator who had given up his nuclear weapons, and he really had. I was there in March of 2004 when he actually made that decision. I accompanied a certain U.S. Senator, Joe Biden was his name. So I was there in 2004. He really did give up his nuclear weapons. He really did give up his ballistic missiles. He was a threat to his own people, but he wasn't a threat to us anymore, Gaddafi. And look what we have now. A state Sharia law. I have many Christian friends in Lebanon and in Syria and in Iraq. Christians, Iraqi Christians, this is my book about Iraqi Christians called St. Peter's Bones, who have fled to Syria from Iraq because the jihadi Muslims are going after them. Now, Assad doesn't protect them. Let's be clear about this, all right? Assad does not protect the Christian minority. He has co-opted some of them the same way that Saddam Hussein did, but he does not protect them. All right. Right now, if Assad were to be pushed from power, the Muslim Brotherhood would take over, just as they've done in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in Libya. It's true that the Iranian regime is Assad's biggest support. It's absolutely true. And it's true that Iran sees Syria as a kind of hinterland for them, for their presence in Lebanon. But I just say, be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for. Unintended consequences of the fall of the Assad regime. I am not trying to tell you that I support the Assad regime, not at all. I would love to see Assad go, but I would love to see there be an authentic, real, organized alternative that was democratic, that was pro-Western, and that was not the Muslim Brotherhood. Right now, it's the Muslim Brotherhood that is forced to take over. Yes, and then John, I'm going to get to you, because I know you're going to respond to that.
You indicated that the United States is not doing anything about these EMPs. Why?
Well, inertia for one thing. How do you wake people up to the threat?
Well, you're aware of it.
Yes.
Why wouldn't members of our government be aware of it?
Yes, and those two EMP commissions have come out publicly. There have been many congressional hearings where they've laid out their findings. And you had William Graham, the head of the commission, who's a distinguished scientist, saying in public in a congressional hearing in July of 2008 that if we are hit with an EMP attack or a massive solar flare, that America will no longer be able to sustain our current population, that 9/10 of the people currently in this country will die. 9/10, 90% of the people in this country will die within a year. And he said this publicly, in a public hearing. Legislatively, what happened is that the Senate got a hold of it and turned the bill into a Christmas tree, as they always do, and tried to add tens of billions of dollars in cybersecurity and cyber warfare and gobbledygook onto it to create a giant feeding trough, as they tend to do in Washington, so all these cybersecurity companies could feed off it. Well, I'm sorry. Cybersecurity, there's a serious cyber threat out there, no doubt about it, but it will not end America as we know it. This is something that will end America as we know it. I think we have to take care of the first things first, and we can deal with the cyber threats that comes along. John, I know you want to respond, I think, to Assad, please.
And just like a comment,
Yeah.
it seems that there's no way to short circuit the period of Islamic fundamentalism after a totalitarian Middle Eastern dictator falls. And, you know, we've seen that in Iran. They've gone 30 years, and now they're leaning towards a more democratic, I mean, the intent of the people seems more democratic than Islamic fundamentalists, as we see in Arab countries. So, you know, it seems like that's the course of history. There's no way to short circuit. Do you see a way to short circuit? I mean, you know, as you said, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, they're all adopting more Islamist forms of government. And, you know, it seems like the Iranians are far advanced. Lebanon started with in 2005, you know, Lebanon obviously has a large Christian population, but that's where the revolution started in 2005, which I would consider the beginning of the quote-unquote Arab Spring. And then you saw it in Iran, you know, 2 years ago, but you know, they received no support from the Obama administration. So, you know, I think that I agree with you that the great hope is that the Iranian people, you know, overthrow their regime and bring in a more just system. But I'm skeptical that the Arab regimes will follow suit without many years, maybe decades of Islamic rule.
I agree with you, but you know something? It doesn't matter. If you get rid of the Islamic Republic of Iran, you've gotten rid of the biggest threat. And those other regimes are tiny compared to the threat of the Islamic Republic.
That's on the Shiite side, but look what you have from the Gulf coming from Saudi Arabia.
So
they've caused quite a bit of trouble themselves.
So what? They don't have nuclear weapons. They do not have nuclear weapons. They do not believe in the same 12th Imam eschatology, although they do, you know, they nominally believe in the 12th Imam, but not the same way that the Iranian regime does.
They're not pushing for Armageddon.
Yeah, they're not pushing for Armageddon in the same way, okay, at all. So I am not worried about whatever happens in the entire rest of the 22 Arab countries, 21 Arab countries, and the Palestinians couldn't care less. When you stack them up against the Islamic Republic of Iran, you know, 21 Arab nations and the Palestinians are like this, and Iran is up here in terms of power and in terms of threat. Take out that Iranian threat, and you change the entire dynamics of the region. Yes, sir.
Given the results of the Arab Spring, what's come out once authoritarian regimes are removed, how is it that you believe that removing the Iranian regime would not just bring another authoritarian regime that would still hate Israel, still want to destroy Israel, and still want to develop nukes for the destruction of Israel? Not to mention the end.
Because the only segment of the Iranian population that cares about Israel are the Islamists currently in charge, even inside the Revolutionary Guard. Even inside the Revolutionary Guard, let's suppose for a second you had a coup d'etat in Iran. Not my favorite option, not what I would push for, a military strongman or a military regime. I do not think that that military regime would have the same attitude towards the United States or towards Israel. I think instead they would want to rebuild Iran from the depredations of 31 years of this miserable clerical regime that's pillaged the country and kept them from developing the way that they feel that they deserve to develop.
But why do you think that? I just don't see
Well,
it.
because I know people who are involved in this, I know people in the hierarchy, I know generals in the Revolutionary Guard, I know what they think.
They have aspirations.
I know what they think. And they just do not share that same genocidal worldview. Are they nice guys? No. But I'm not going to lose sleep over them the same way that I would over the current regime. First in the back and then to you. Yes.
Well, let's leave the Middle East for a second. Just for a second, we're going to go right back to it. We're in the midst of a political thing here. Of those who are currently running for the presidential office, including the man who's already there, anybody you think would be able to do anything about it? Or where would you like to put your money? On which one or ones of these?
I'm not going to step into that. I'm not going to step into that. I'm not going to make a political statement here in a synagogue. I have my political preferences, obviously. I'm not a flaming liberal. I think you've found that out already. And I believe that America has a strategic relationship with Israel that we need to preserve. And I think that we are in this fight together. And I think there's some politicians in this country who do not believe that. And you can see that. That is self-evident. I don't need to comment on that. Now, for some of the candidates who may or may not have international experience, I seem to remember that the current occupant of the White House was criticized for not having any international experience either. So that no longer seems to be a criteria for office in this country. So I'm not particularly worried about that. I would look at a candidate's values and the way that they make their decisions. What kind of questions do they ask to make their decisions? I would look at that more than their foreign policy experience.
I'd like to ask you whether you could comment on the recent cyber attack on Iran by parties unknown, and what you can tell us that doesn't appear in the paper.
The Stuxnet virus, and now there's a new version of it apparently that's being developed, appears to have done some serious damage to the Bushehr nuclear power plant and to their centrifuge plant at Natanz. From what the Iranians have declared publicly to the IAEA, in other words, what they want us to know, telling us, probably around 1,000 of the roughly 6,000 operating centrifuges went down as a result of the Stuxnet. May have actually blown up. Possibly, may have actually blown up. Because what Stuxnet did, very, very small. It went into the control systems of the motors of these centrifuges. These centrifuges are turning. They're like giant butter churns, if you wish. 2 meters high, 6 feet high, about this big around, and they turn at 60,000 revolutions a minute. And they have to be very, very well balanced. I mean, it has to be perfect. Think of, when your tire's out of balance on your car, you're going 60 miles an hour, and you can feel like, well, it's 60,000 RPMs, and it's just the slightest bit off, you're in big trouble. And if it gets a little bit more off, it goes off the skids and it explodes. And if it's filled with uranium, it's a real mess. Uranium gas, it's a real mess. Isn't that terrible? What a horrible thing.
Tragic.
Now, hold on a second. Before you think that's a piece of no time, which the Washington Post recently declared, the Iranians have recovered from it. They have recovered from it. And they've put back those centrifuges. They are now back in operation. And it may have gained us 2 years, might have gained us 2 years. So from my point of view, a very positive experiment. Slowed down, appears to have slowed down the Iranian program. Has it stopped it? No. Ma'am.
Is there any reason to believe that any country in Europe today is as concerned about EMP as you say they should be? Is there any awareness there? Has anyone expressed any deep concern about it?
Have any countries in Europe expressed the same kind of concern about EMP? I haven't seen it. There are countries in Europe, in particular France, also Germany and Britain, who are concerned about Iran and their nuclear weapons program. But I haven't heard them talk about EMP. Maybe they think that by keeping silent, they won't give the Iranians any ideas. Believe me, they already have those ideas. Yes, sir. And then
you mentioned that this past year you were able to go in and out of Iran.
no, Iraq. Northern Iraq, right along the border of Iran. I can see them up top spinning down.
Oh, all right. But just to say, what is your view on the 3 American hikers that were arrested and imprisoned? Was that just political scapegoats, or you think
hostages?
Hostages, that was
They're
it?
hostages, of course. And they were pretty dumb. No, come on, they were 28. I was pretty dumb at 28 too, okay? I did some pretty dumb things like get taken hostage in Lebanon. So you do dumb things when you're 28 years old. But they were walking, I can tell you where they were walking up in there, okay? They were walking up in the mountains in a park, and these are big mountains. This is not the White Mountains or the Green Mountains, okay? This is like the Rockies. this is 12, 13, 14,000 foot mountains separating Iran and Iraq. And they were up there hiking, up on the top, you know, along the ridge line, the crest line. And they saw a border patrol. You know, in the middle of nowhere, they saw a little hut. That's what border patrol is. Not border patrol. It was a little hut, right? And the guy comes out and says, "Oh, come and have tea, drink tea with me. Oh, let's talk, American good." You know, they went over there like
idiots.
dumb kids they were. And he said, "Oh, American good, under arrest. my friend for a long time, my guest for a long time." That's what happens. That's how they got taken hostages. And you know, you heard the statements that they made when they came back here. What can I say? Some people just never learn. I learned. I went in when I was taken prisoner, taken hostage by the Palestinians. You know, I probably would have said a lot of the things that they said going in. Not when I got out. Not when I got out. Yes.
The Palestinian American Jewish Support Organization called J Street has decided to ally itself with the National Iranian American Council, headed by Trita Parsi. I'd like to hear your comments on the NIAC.
The question is about the Palestinian Support Organization known as J Street, and their alliance with the National Iranian American Council, and I would say also with Grover Norquist of Americans for Tax Reform, who pretends to be a conservative activist. I haven't yet decided, I haven't figured out what is conservative about his support for gay marriage, or Grover Norquist's support for gays in the military, or his support for same-sex marriage. Like I said, same-sex marriage, open borders, no secret evidence, ending Gitmo, but he calls himself a conservative, and he's in that alliance as well. We have, in this country, a serious effort by our enemies to infiltrate and penetrate our nation's political body, whether it's on the left or whether it's on the right. I consider the National Iranian American Council to be an Iranian regime effort to penetrate the United States. I consider some of Grover Norquist's activities to be a tantamount to a front for the Muslim Brotherhood. So I believe that we need to wake up to efforts to infiltrate our society, to infiltrate the power structures, our political organizations. And I think we need to push back and recognize this. My organization certainly pushes back against NIAC and Trita Parsi. And if you go to our website, iran.org, you'll find a lot of information about him. I called him the mullah's voice. This is 4 or 5 years ago. He's the mullah's voice. He may or may not be a paid lobbyist for the Iranian regime. I don't know whether he's getting money from them. I can't prove that. But his positions, his political positions, are identical to those that Tehran would like us to take. And he eats dinner with Hillary Clinton and boasts of this. He's been sent out by the State Department as an emissary on trips around the world, as have, by the way, a number of Muslim Brotherhood representatives here in this country. So I think we need to push back against that type of thing. Over there, and oh, sorry, and then Phil, yeah.
You talked a little bit about Turkey and the AKP and whether there really is a mild Islamic party concept in the region.
I think the question is, who lost Turkey? The AKP party is an Islamist party. The goal of the AKP party and Erdogan is to reestablish the caliphate that Atatürk abolished in 1924, and the Muslim Brotherhood was created 4 years later to reestablish. Now, you're going to hear from some so-called experts on the Middle East who say, well, you know, there's this big rivalry between Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia. Well, there's some rivalry between the three of them. They want to know who's going to be top dog, who's going to be in charge of the caliphate, but they all want to restore the caliphate in different ways. And they work together, sometimes. Turks and the Iranians do. We've seen them over the past 3 years militarily working together against the Kurds. I've seen it myself on the ground in northern Iraq. You have a joint Turkish-Iranian military headquarters in Urmiya, Iran, with Turkish generals and Turkish special forces trainers training Iranian Revolutionary Guards on how to whack the Kurds, how to do counterinsurgency warfare. They are using Heron UAVs purchased from Israel when Israel still had a military relationship with Turkey over the battle space in northern Iraq against the Kurds. The Iranians are using, the Turks are flying them, but the Iranians are using them. So you have a military and strategic relationship between Turkey and Iran. And Turkey, at the same time, is still a member of NATO. I think it's time that we give the Turkish government a choice. Either they sever a military strategic relationship with Iran, or they sever their relationship with NATO. I should say, or we sever their relationship with NATO. Philip.
Yeah, I had two questions. The first one is the extent of the influence operations of the Iranians in the United States. Compare that to the Muslim Brotherhood influence operations inside the United States. The second question is, we could talk about the global reach of Hezbollah, the connections with Iran and Hezbollah globally, like in the United States and Europe.
Well, the Iranians have been operationally engaged in the United States in influence operations and with networks since before the takeover by Khomeini in 1979. However, they are on a, I think over the years, the Muslim Brotherhood has overtaken in sophistication and in sheer numbers. You have literally hundreds of Muslim Brotherhood front organizations operating here in the United States today. You have dozens of Iranian regime front organizations. I mean, that's just a rough comparison. So there are many, many more Muslim Brotherhood groups operating to undermine our society and to undermine the United States Constitution through the imposition of Sharia law or Sharia creep. The Iranians have a problem in that there are anywhere from 700,000 to 2 million Iranian Americans, most of whom were refugees from the Islamic Republic. So they were escaping this kind of Islamic fundamentalism which now has gripped their country. Do they want to support those front organizations for the Iranian regime? No way. In fact, they are pushing back. They are pushing back against NIAC, and they're pushing back wherever they find these other groups. And they have been terrific allies to us. The Iranian American community has been terrific allies in the war on terror and the war against these influence operations. So there's some significant differences. Hezbollah in the Western Hemisphere, we have seen an increasing number of what the Customs and Border Patrol calls other than Mexicans, OTMs coming across our southern border, many of which come from countries on the terrorism list, including Iran. We have a number of drug cartel members who have been arrested, put in U.S. prisons, and tattoos who have had, they drug cartels all have their own tattoos. It's pretty elaborate, all over their bodies. Some of them have Hezbollah tattoos in either Arabic or Farsi. And you can see there are pictures of these things on the internet. You can see them. They've been submitted to in evidence in hearings in Congress. So it's pretty clear that Hezbollah has been practicing over the years with the drug cartels, penetrating our borders, finding the best way to get across for when they want to bring something really significant, if they haven't already done it. And we saw that with the recent terrorist plot with this Iranian-American in Texas, the used car salesman, whose cousin just happened to be a Revolutionary Guards general back in Tehran. We kind of forget that. And if he had just picked the right Mexican as his partner for this terror plot, instead of a DEA informant, the headlines would have been, Mexican drug war comes to Washington, not Iranian terror plot foiled by the FBI. a couple more, see who hasn't.
What do you think about our withdrawal of the troops from Iraq?
What do I think about our withdrawal, the withdrawal of our troops from Iraq? Well, I think of the 4,500, mostly young men, who've given their lives, and I say a prayer. I think that we have won the war militarily thanks to those sacrifices. We've defeated the terrorist networks thanks to those sacrifices. And we are in the process of losing the peace by a failure of political will. Iraq is now primarily controlled by Iran, with the exception of the Kurdish region in the north, which remains a strong ally of the United States, and yet understands how fragile their peace is. The Iranians are infiltrating that border. The Iranian Kurdish group known as Pt2, which is protecting the border from the Revolutionary Guards, keeping the Revolutionary Guards from